The Sandman is Netflix's live-action adaptation of Neil Gaiman's award-winning comic series, which ran for 75 issues from 1989 to 1996. Long deemed unfilmable, I sort of went into this with excitement and trepidation. People who know me know how much I love Spider-Man, but to give you an idea of just how much I love the original comic series, if there was only one comic run I was allowed to ever read again, it would be The Sandman. I love it that much. Now I'll get the positives out of the way first. This is largely, I'd say 80% or so, a faithful adaptation to Preludes and Nocturnes and The Doll's House, and half of Dream Country, which I'll get to in a minute. And that accounts for basically the first 18 issues or so of the comic series. Now this series looks great, it's acted great, and I appreciate the lengths that Gaiman went to provide as faithful an adaptation as he could. The basic premise is Dream, or Morpheus as he's sometimes called, is one of the Endless. He rules over the domain of dreams and stories, and he's accidentally caught by some cultists who hope to catch his older sister, Death. Imprisoned for decades, he eventually escapes and sets about rebuilding his dream kingdom and sort of hunting down rogue nightmares who have escaped into the real world. And while this is going on, a young woman named Rose turns out to be a dream vortex, able to collapse dreams in on themselves and threatening to destroy the very fabric of the dream realm and Morpheus himself. That's the basic gist of the first season. There's a lot more going on, but that's a quick high-level synopsis. Now, the acting in this is great. Tom Sturridge is excellent as Morpheus. He's got this aloofness and disregard for humanity that really works, which is how it's supposed to be, because Morpheus is not human. He's beyond humanity, so following him as he sort of tries to connect with humans on a fundamental, sort of understanding sort of way, emotionally, nails the comic counterpart to a T. Much has been made of this sort of gender and race swapped characters in the show. For example, Death is no longer a pasty white goth girl, but played by a black actress named Kirby Howell-Baptiste. She's awesome in this. I never once was watching this show and getting distressed that someone doesn't look like their comic book counterpart. Hell, Morpheus himself doesn't even look like he does in the comics. So I don't really get the complaints about all that. I think Gaiman said, actually, if he were writing the comic today, this is how these characters would look and act. And if you're complaining about that kind of thing in this show, just keep in mind that the Sandman comic series is about the telling of stories and the mutability of characters within those stories. So this fits right in line with what Neil Gaiman would have been doing back in the day anyway. Now, what I do take issue with in a lot of this show isn't the talent of the actors on display, but rather sort of how they're portrayed. Cain and Abel are a good example of this. Like in the comics, specifically in the first couple volumes, Cain is very clearly sort of an evil asshole from the jump, and Abel is, very terrified constantly when he's being around him. Really emphasizes the dichotomy of that relationship and how different they are. It isn't quite like that in this show. Cain comes across as kind of like a pretty decent fellow until he doesn't. Roderick Burgess is another character that is changed from the comics. He's the Magus who traps Dream. In the comics, he immediately knows that he has not captured Death and goes into a rage. It shows a level of intelligence and knowledge of the Endless that really speaks to that character's intimidation level. Even though he's just a human, he sort of knows exactly who Dream is, and he just doesn't give a fuck. In the show, he has no idea who they've actually caught initially, and they have to sort of pigeonhole in the Corinthian, who's a character who barely shows up in the initial comic run, to sort of explain it to him. That kind of stuff. Little details like that were just kind of like, man, why couldn't they just go there? They're doing so many other things trying to adapt it exactly like the comic. Why couldn't they just do little things like that to really give those characters an extra oomph? And the show also pulls its punches a bit. The episode that adapts 24 Hours does not go nearly as dark as the comic, which I knew was going to happen because in the episode prior, I think it was, John Dee does not kill the woman who drives him to the Ruby like he does in the comic. In the comic, there's this great moment because Gaiman builds the entire issue up that John Dee is sort of like a sympathetic character the entire issue, and then he sort of just pulls the rug out from the reader by showing that, yeah, John Dee was going to kill her regardless of how nice he was acting and regardless of what this woman did. And it just goes to show a little bit about the psychosis of that character, which is sort of gone in this show. It's just little stuff like that that really bothered me, especially when they were trying so hard to give that faithful adaptation with everything else. And it's probably just because I'm such a diehard fan of the original comics. I just love everything about the comics and the characters in them. That just disappointed me a little bit that they changed some stuff like that. On the flip side, I will say one aspect I did think worked better for the series is Dream's battle against Lucifer. You know, in the comics, Dreams plays the game with the demon who has his helmet rather than Lucifer, who he battles in the show. And I felt like that worked much better to set up his encounters with Lucifer down the line, who's played by Gwendolyn Christie, who again is awesome. She's basically awesome in everything she's in. And I really loved her as Lucifer, and they kind of set up I don't know if it's a bit of a stinger at the end, the last sort of scene of the final episode of the series. Makes me kind of wonder where they're going to go with it, because if you know the next storyline, a main storyline that involves Lucifer, I don't want to spoil anything, but it might not be the battle that you're expecting it's going to be. I'll be curious to see how they're going to play that out. This is sort of the same way I feel about Neil Gaiman's American Gods adaptation. For the first couple seasons, I think he was involved in that, and they adapt it as close as they can, but they change little things about the characters that made you love them in the first place and really made those characters really stand out in your mind and just sit there with you for many, many years. So, that being said, you know, my fiance, she had no prior knowledge of the Sandman before watching this show. I was like, hey, have you ever heard of this comic book? And she's like, nope. And she was going to look into it. I said, don't look into it at all. I want you to just go into this cold, because I was curious what she would think, you know, not really knowing anything about this or what it was going to be. And she loved it. So that sort of shows the power of Gaiman's writing, how it sort of transcends mediums. And I really love the idea that they are keeping with the comic tradition of not everything is sort of this like linear thing. I mean, the comic series is great because, you know, Morpheus, Dream, is ostensibly the main character of it. However, there are many, many issues and many, many story arcs where he barely shows up. And he's not the main character in his own title. And I like that they are kind of continuing to do that here. And I was a little concerned is if they did adapt it that way, how a sort of quote-unquote normie who is used to sort of traditional narrative storytelling would take that. But you know, at least my one anecdotal example, it went over as a hit. It was really good. So I also want to say that I love that they dropped this special episode with Calliope and Dream of a Thousand Cats from the Dream Country volume. I wish more shows would do this, where the main run is sort of done, but then they just throw out, hey, here's a special surprise bonus episode that we didn't tell you about at all. And A Dream of a Thousand Cats is funny because everyone knows how much I hate cats, but I love that story, and I think that story is so great. And the way that they did it with like these oil paintings was just fantastic, which makes me incredibly excited because I know they're going to do a Midsummer Night's Dream, which is my favorite Sandman story of all time, and I can't wait for that. So if they do a season 2, which my guess is they will, it looks like they would adapt a Season of Mists, which Dream is a main character of. He's kind of like the central figure going to sort of quote-unquote battle Lucifer and all the things that come along with that. But then the second volume, A Game of You, Dream is barely in it at all. So I'm curious as to how that they are going to work that. A Game of You is actually about the Barbie character who's in the first season of this show very briefly. She's actually the main character of that volume, and it's like a 6-issue arc. It's a pretty big thing, so I'll be curious how they do that. Should you watch it? Yes. If only because I want to see an adaptation of Gaiman's Midsummer Night's Dream, and you need to make Netflix give me what I want. So with that, I'll give this a solid B. Definitely worth a watch. The Sandman, go check it out.